So let me start off by saying I really like to explore old mines. It's kind of a thrill for me because I'm mildly claustrophobic. That sounds weird, I know. Why would someone explore an old mine if they're scared of enclosed places? The thing about it though is that it really gives you a kind of a rush. When I was a kid, I got lost in a cave, you see, and although it did freak me out quite a bit, it also made me feel so alive. When I began to explore though, I chose mines instead of caves because mines are harder to get lost in. Caves are a lot more scary in my mind. Generally, I just travel to the end of the available mine, my heart pounding in my chest the whole way. Then I'd try to get out as quickly as possible. Each and every time I swore to myself I would never again go into another mine. But I'd always get the itch to go just once more, almost immediately after I'd left. I was going to explore a mine in West Virginia. I won't mention the name of it because technically I didn't have a legal right to be there. I actually even had to park my car on the side of the highway and walk there, which was a pretty big risk. There were no cars coming for a while, so I jumped the railing and the fence and made my way over toward that mine. I had done tons of research to try and find where this place was online, so I was able to figure it out pretty quickly. I knew this one was going to be a relatively straight trip from the portal/entrance to the mine to the back. It was about 1,000 feet deep or so. There was a chance that by the time I got to the end, I wouldn't even be able to see the entrance anymore. My heart instantly began racing as I thought of that. Fortunately, although the mine was a bit damp, it wasn't very wet like some of the others I'd encountered, so I wouldn't be having too difficult a time. So there I was entering the mine, and of course my heart started beating faster right away. I had to walk very slowly because I didn't want to get surprised and trip on anything. No one knew where I was, so if I got hurt, no one would be able to find me, and I'd have to get out of trouble myself. I made a habit of turning around every 50 feet or so to look around and make sure I could still see the entrance. Of course, it got smaller and smaller the further I went into the mine, and the more my heart thudded in my ears and my chest. When I'd gotten halfway deep into the mine, I turned around and saw the entrance was now very, very far away. It was just barely visible. The mine was so dark, too. I had a small flashlight with me to see where I was going, but I didn't want to use it until I absolutely had to. As I mentioned before, the only reason I did this in the first place was because I so enjoyed the thrill of being scared that the flashlight would have kept me from being so. As I descended further into this mine, I thought I heard a sudden sound. It sounded a bit like a giggle or something. I immediately stopped in my tracks and tried to listen a bit closer. After a few moments of nothing though, I decided it must have just been in my head. I began to walk a bit further. About 700 feet into the mine, I heard that same giggle once more. I again stopped, this time feeling my heartbeat leap into my throat. I turned around and looked at how deep I was in. I considered going back for a moment, but I figured this must just be in my imagination. Who the hell would be down here other than me? I wanted to make it as far in as I could go, so I kept on walking. When I got closer to the end of the mine, I heard that giggle again. Only thing was, this particular time, I was absolutely sure I just heard this, close by too. It was not my imagination. This time it didn't stop either. It was coming from right behind me. I fumbled in my pocket and pulled out my flashlight. I flipped it on, turning around. Sitting right in front of me were two little girls, holding their hands over their mouths while they were laughing. They looked at me, and in the darkness their eyes looked completely black. One of the girls took her hand away from her mouth for a moment and pointed behind me further into the mine. I dropped my flashlight in surprise. It broke on the rocks, but I didn't care about that right then. The laughing didn't stop, even though I couldn't see either of them anymore. Immediately, I began to sprint my way back out of the mine. The giggling didn't seem to get any quieter though. Actually, I thought those girls must be following me. It remained almost completely dark until I was almost back to the entrance of the cave. I didn't dare to look back. I hopped out of that mine and ran to my car, which fortunately was right where I had left it. That was not my last time in an abandoned mine, but I can tell you it was the last time I ever went to that one. I watch a lot of videos, and I found one where a person was talking about hanging out in the closet and listening to creepypastas. That struck a chord with me, because actually I do that quite a lot too. Once I had a very freaky experience while doing so. I just had to write about it. I mean, what are the chances someone else would be in that same situation I was? Much like the person in that story, I thought it was the best way to try and get scared by these creepypastas. It was the only place in my home I could go where it was completely dark. Once I even tried putting duct tape over my bedroom window to keep the light out, but that didn't work so well. On this particular night, I was sitting there in the closet listening to some really good creepypasta, although I was having a pretty hard time getting into the right mood. I closed my computer lid and tried to listen to it that way. At least then it would be totally dark without the monitor on. That didn't really do very much for me though. It kinda sucked actually. I was hoping that the darkness would really get me into the ambiance and get me scared, you know? That's what the dark is supposed to do. But it just wasn't happening tonight. At least I was having a good time listening to the stories themselves, as they were pretty good. I had been listening to this particularly long playlist and must have been in the closet for about 3 hours. I moved and stood up for a few moments to stretch my legs. It was about 2 in the morning as I did so. Right as I leaned against the closet wall, the closet light turned on. The light switch was right outside the closet door on the left side of it, and I lived alone. That meant someone just flipped that switch, and not only had they just done that, they must be standing right outside the closet door. I froze, finally feeling that fear I'd wanted so badly to feel. Now I was really regretting it though. I had no idea what to do. I didn't have anything to protect myself with. It was just me and my trusty laptop computer in there. All I could do was stand there in complete fear, expecting any moment the door was going to burst open. When it did, I was sure I was going to die. I stood there and watched and listened, but no one opened that door. I waited for hours because I was too scared to check myself. When the sun finally rose, I got the nerve to open up the door myself. I looked around my room. It seemed there was no one there. Cautiously, I staked out the rest of my apartment for a hidden intruder. I didn't find anyone, but I did find my living room window wide open with the screen removed. My PS4 and my television were gone as well, so I guess I had been robbed. Someone had come into the house who must have known I was there in the closet. Did they scare me because they knew it would give them time to rob me and I would be too freaked out to explore outside? Or did they think that light was for something else and left when they turned it on and discovered me there? I have no idea, but that was the freakiest experience of my life. Make sure your windows are always secured. When I was about 13 years old, I used to love going to explore out in the hills around my aunt's house. It was really fun, and I often found some really interesting things out there too. One time I stumbled upon this cave. Part of me really wanted to go and explore it, but I knew it really wouldn't be a good idea by myself. I decided to save that for another time. When I went home though, it really began to bother me. I regretted not exploring that cave. I felt like I was some sort of coward some way, and I really didn't want to feel that way. I wanted to go back and find out what was in there. About a month later, I went to stay with my aunt again. This time, I knew I was gonna seek out that cave and explore it to its fullest. I brought a flashlight and a snack and some water as well. I didn't really need much because I knew it would be a shallow cave, and it wouldn't take me very long at all. After about an hour of exploring the hills, I finally found that cave again. I guess I should explain the kind of cave it was. It was on the rocky side of a hill, and the entrance was quite short. I would have to get on my belly and push myself under it. Looking at it, I knew it would be an extremely tight fit. My curiosity was really strong though, so I decided to go ahead and go for it. I got down on my belly and slowly began to crawl into that cave. I wasn't sure how deep it was, or if it ever got any taller. What I was sure about was that it was very dark inside. The entrance was so small that not much light was able to get inside it. Thank God I decided to bring the flashlight with me. Right as I began crawling in further though, I became aware of this really odd noise, a sort of rustling sound, followed by a weird shrieking noise. It sent a real shiver down my spine. In a bit of panic, I moved down a bit. I moved my foot and got it wedged in tight between the ceiling and wall. I groaned out of pain and out of desperation for my stupidity. I tried to pull my foot out, but I wasn't able to move it because it was throbbing in agony. I cried out a bit, and then I heard that rustling noise again. It was too dark to see anything, so I grabbed for my flashlight. The sound was probably just nothing, but I would of course be scared until I knew that for sure. I moved my hand on the flashlight and switched it on, then moved it toward the direction of that sound. I saw the worst possible thing. A cave full of the scariest looking bats I'd ever seen, only a couple of yards away from me. They were hanging from the ceiling, and all of them were staring at me. I screamed and did my best to pull myself free. My leg throbbed in agony as I moved. I don't know what it was, the crying or the flashlight, but the bats got restless, and they started to fly right at me. Stupidly but instinctively, I swatted at them to defend myself. Two things happened in that moment. My leg finally pulled loose of the wall, and the bats began to bite me because I'd swatted at them. It felt like I was jabbed with sharp, thin needles. I screamed again and tried to pull myself out of that cave. If you've ever seen the movie Terminator, my experience was very similar to Sarah Connor's climbing through the machinery at the end. My leg was injured now, and I was crawling through an area that my body was wedged into. I was panicked and scared of the bats all around me trying to bite me. I was scared I was going to get something real bad because I'd just gotten bit. It took me a long time to crawl my way out. I was breathing heavy with fear, and I had never felt so claustrophobic before. It took me a long time to get out, and by the time I did, I was hyperventilating. I tried to stand up on my foot, but my leg gave out. I had to crawl the rest of the way until I was able to get a broken branch on the ground I could use as a crutch. I was hurting real bad, and I was scared I had probably just contracted rabies. I felt super sick. It took me nearly 3 hours to limp back to my aunt's house. In my gut, I just felt I had rabies and was going to die. If I had been more educated about bats, I would have known that only 0.5% of them actually carry rabies. My feeling of being sick was probably psychosomatic, exacerbated by my fear and anxiety of hurting my foot. But I had to get a rabies shot anyway. It wasn't nearly as bad as people might tell you it is. Still not pleasant by any means, though. Turns out my ankle had been fractured, and I had to get a cast for it. Nowadays, I don't go into small caves or other small areas either. I'm completely claustrophobic, and although more educated about bats now, I'm scared shitless by them. When I was around 15 or so, my mom and stepfather got divorced in a pretty dramatic way. The whole household was turned upside down, and everyone's routines were thrown off. Mom was out doing something most nights after work. My little sister spent more time with her friends, and I became something of a night owl, usually waiting until the wee morning hours to lie down. Our house was a simple one in a rural area, 2 stories with a huge backyard sharing a fence with both a cow pasture and the entrance to these really thick woods. The house had a lot of problems, but I enjoyed taking over the maintenance and gardening work. They gave me something to do when I was feeling depressed at the time. For some perspective, our kitchen windows looked out directly to the fence described above. The left half of it bordered one of the black corners of the big cow pasture, while the right half bordered the entrance to the woods. It had a rather overgrown trailhead on that side, just barely visible from the kitchen window. For the most part though, all you could really see was overgrown grass and shrubbery, at least 4 or 5 feet high. Perhaps some low-hanging trees of mixed oak and cedar variety. This backdrop added a sort of eerie tranquility to our property, which I appreciated from the very first day we moved in. One night I took a break from my homework after realizing I'd stayed up way too late on a Thursday night, even for my standards. I went downstairs to make some food, and my dog followed behind me like she always did. There I was making a grilled cheese in the kitchen. While I was at the sink cleaning out the pan for the next batch, I noticed some of the grass from the wood lines start to shuffle around. Now that really startled me at first, but as soon as I began to fixate on it, I saw no more disturbance. We lived in wildlife country at the time, so I figured it was probably a deer, coyote, or a cougar. Unsurprising for the latter, given the farmer who owned the pasture had dozens of cows, and sometimes did not bring them in at night. Strangely enough though, I began to notice this even more often in the nights following. Always, whenever I was doing dishes after eating, I would look out the window, only to see grass shuffling around, then see nothing further as I fixated on the spot. I was always a fan of scary movies, and I tended to be a jumpy kid already. Each time I did my best to convince myself I wasn't really seeing any sort of pattern. This changed though, when my dog would start fixating on the woods too, and barking at night. Furthermore, our motion sensor security light began to stay activated sometimes, for hours on end, only switching off when I would go to the kitchen to make my midnight snacks. Eventually, I told my mom all about this, and while she did initially seem concerned, she also pointed out that we did live behind the woods after all, so we should expect animals or occasional homeless squatters nearby our property. If I was really that concerned, I could always just call the police or animal control. I didn't really disagree myself, and for the most part gave the matter no further thought each night forward. One particular night though, I decided at 1 a.m. spontaneously to take a dip in our hot tub in the backyard. I changed and my dog and I went outside. I climbed into the tub, closed my eyes, and zoned out like usual. I was suddenly whipped out of my trance when I heard a loud crunch, followed by what sounded like someone falling over into some bushes. I stood up immediately and turned around. "Who's there?" No one replied. It was dead silent, and I had the creeps now. I quickly put on my robe and rushed inside. The very next day, I told my neighbor friend and at the time crush about this. She thought I was being ridiculous, but nonetheless agreed to go with me to check out that part of the woods to see if there was any evidence of anyone or anything hiding in that direction I'd heard the noise coming from. We stomped through the woods until we got to where we could see the back of my house. We checked under every shrub and blackberry bush, but found nothing. It was probably just a coyote or something, deciding whether or not you would make a good dinner, the neighborhood girl said, smirking. I playfully flipped her off and laughed, quietly relieved there was no creepy person stalking me the previous night. Well, of course, I was wrong about that, because that night as I was making my usual dinner, our security light came on once again. I raced to the back door to see what was up. This time though, I could barely make out a shadowy 6-foot figure disappearing through the trailhead and into the brush to the right of it. My heart skipped a beat, and my dog, probably sensing my nerves, began to growl furiously. I called out into the night, "Who the fuck's out there? Come out right now!" Of course, there was nothing but silence. After sitting in the dining room for an hour, I figured I must be being paranoid. Maybe I was seeing something subconsciously, afraid of being out in the dark. I called my neighbor back, and she surprisingly didn't call me crazy this time. She told me she would tell her dad about it in the morning. I never saw that sort of thing again, and my neighbor's dad just chalked it up to being a homeless person camping out in the woods. Very most a stalker from one of the houses around ours. Something he explained wouldn't be surprising, as my sister was quite a looker. He thought it would make sense she would have a stalker, as if that was supposed to make me feel better or something. I suppose, though, in the end it did. Months passed by and I forgot about this fairly quickly. That is, until a local news bulletin came out about a sexual predator having been recently apprehended by local police. It was a report from a couple living a few houses down from us, filed about the wife being approached at night by a tall, gaunt man in the evening hours when she was watering her garden boxes. She said he'd suddenly appear from the woodwork, quietly as if trying to sneak up on her. When she noticed him, she demanded his name, but he darted back into the woods. She called the sheriff immediately, unlike me, and a half an hour or so later, the department combed through those woods and apprehended the man, who was hiding underneath a fallen tree nearby. All the report said was that the man claimed he had been living in the woods for months, surviving on snacks stolen from a nearby gas station, and would not give a reason for why he was out there. Supposedly, he was wanted for numerous sexual offenses on minors and vulnerable adults some years prior, whatever those ended up being. Now, years later, I still get uncomfortable looking out into the woods at night, anywhere I may live. Who can blame me?